I'm Perry Parks. Dr. Kevin Baiko I met about 10 years ago, and I was kind of surprised because he had a cannabis business. He had patients. He currently has in the neighborhood of several thousand patients in Hawaii. He flies to Hawaii every other month to treat those patients, and he's been doing so for 10 years. I tell you that because what you're going to see today is what we know today. And a lot of that comes from Israel. And the other thing I want to tell you, and I wanted to make sure I got out here, he is an MD, but he has several CDs. One about pakalolo. Pakalolo is the Hawaiian word for cannabis.
Dr. Baiko.
And thank you, Representative Alexander, and your staff for putting this together. I'd also like to thank the University of North Carolina, Charlotte for hosting the event. All right. Well, some people might be familiar with this concept. After almost a century of propaganda demonizing cannabis and almost a half a century of a drug war that victimizes the people who use cannabis, it's not surprising to still come across people who will have a mentality that cannabis is not a medicine, that medical marijuana is just an excuse to get high, that it's a gateway drug to harder, more dangerous substances. And I hope there actually are some skeptics in the crowd, because hopefully you might learn something that you can share with some other people. Or maybe you know some skeptics that those in the choir to whom I'm preaching, you can share some of this information as well. I'm going to share a little science that maybe will demystify this issue. And why should you care? Well, as was mentioned earlier, there is an opioid crisis in this country. Opioid medications are painkillers. They're highly addictive. Their use results in tolerance. In other words, people tend to keep needing to use more and more to have the same effect. And as you can see, it's rising. It just keeps getting steeper and steeper, the curve, especially over this last 5 years. The thing is, these rising death rates related to opiate overdose are seen in men and women of all ethnicities across all age groups, 15 and up. According to the CDC, amongst new heroin users, 3 out of 4 report having abused prescription opioids prior to using heroin. So you can see the heroin is the light blue there. Then you have just below that and above that prescription drugs. The green line is all of them together. So things are getting worse. What about here in North Carolina? Well, there's an opioid crisis here too. The CDC reports that 97 prescriptions for painkillers for every 100 people in North Carolina. Let me say this again. There are 97 prescriptions for painkillers for every 100 people in North Carolina. There's a lot of people in pain. And so they go to their doctor to have that pain treated. Fatal drug overdoses in North Carolina have quintupled since 1999. That's 5 times. All North Carolina counties have seen increase, some now the highest in the nation. Anybody here from Wilmington? Well, Wilmington is number 1, right there. So this is an epidemic. This is a crisis. Overdoses now cause more deaths in North Carolina than car crashes and gun shootings. Twice as many deaths from overdose than murder in North Carolina. And you can see it just keeps getting worse. And this is the state we live in. And we've allowed this to happen. So it's depressing news. Tell me some good news, Doc. Well, there are options. The good news is that we've seen a decrease in opioid prescriptions and deaths from opioid overdose in states that have legalized cannabis for medical use. I think it was the JAMA study in 2014 said 25% decrease. And this has been my experience as a cannabinoid specialist, that most of my patients who are on opiate medications, they want to get off. They don't like the side effects, they don't like the tolerance, the dependency that taking these medications can cause. There's a desperation if they can't get their prescriptions filled. And of course, on the doctor's side, there's a stigmatization. So patients don't want to be treated like they're a drug user because they just want to have their pain go away. What I've also seen is that patients who are using cannabis and opiate medications can get by on lower doses with less need to compensate for the tolerance that develops. And many patients can even get off the opioid medications altogether. So truly, cannabis should be seen as an exit gateway drug to these harder prescription pain medications. In my patients, I see improved quality of life, the improved outlook, and improved functionality. In other words, these patients can enjoy life, they can go and work, they can be productive and lead a good life using cannabis. A lot of my patients, more and more now, are coming in, they don't want to get on, they're in pain, they maybe had some sort of an accident, or they have some sort of a chronic inflammatory condition, they're in chronic pain, they don't want to ever get on the opiates because they're aware of this situation. So that's a very common thing. Doc, I don't want to get on the pain drugs. The ER doc gave them to me, I didn't even fill the prescription, can you help me? And these patients do very well on cannabis alone. So, over half the states in the country have passed medical cannabis legislation, including DC. And I didn't include the CBD-only states like North Carolina because, frankly, in my experience, it doesn't do nearly the job that it needs to do. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that is as I get into my presentation. But these states generally are qualifying patients who have conditions like cancer, HIV, glaucoma, PTSD, chronic pain, nausea, severe cramps, spasms, appetite disorder, and seizures. And this isn't a new medicine. It's been used since ancient, probably prehistoric times. The earliest written reference was from the Chinese Rai'a, can you believe how it's pronounced? Dating back to 3,500 years ago. It's been shown evidence to be used in Egyptian, Indian, Greek, Roman, Islamic pharmacopoeias. So there's nothing new about this as a medicine. It was introduced back in the 1830s to Western medicine. The credit is given to the Irish physician William O'Shaughnessy in the 1830s. And it enjoyed increasing widespread mainstream medical use until it was prohibited about 100 years after that in 1937. Now, this is a picture of the cannabinoids that are produced by the plant cannabis, and you can see right there is THC. That is the most notorious of all the cannabinoids. It was talked about a little bit earlier because it's responsible for the high that people can experience. But it's only one of well over 60 cannabinoids that are found in the plant, and it seems to play a major role in helping the other cannabinoids have their effect. There's a synergistic effect, and the THC seems to be the main key. And then when you add the other cannabinoids, you have all kinds of beneficial health effects. So there is a synergy. They're more effective together than as isolated agents. Now it's interesting that the synthetic version of THC, dronabinol or marinol, which is just concentrated, isolated THC, does not work as well. It's less effective and it causes more unpleasant side effects than when the plant is taken as a whole medicine, as a whole herb. And this is why the CBD-only medications and the CBD-only legislation really doesn't cut it for the majority of patients. It's also worth noting that whenever you take a particular substance and you isolate it and you concentrate it, you're increasing its potential lethality. And we'll talk a little bit about that also with regards to opiates and pretty much any other medication in which you have an isolated, concentrated substance. Now, it wasn't until 1988 that we discovered that we have cannabinoid receptors. This is what is activated by the cannabinoids found in the cannabis plant. And these are found in all vertebrate animals, from fish to mammals, most especially in the brain. It's throughout the body, but most especially in the central nervous system. The most common of which is the CB1 receptor. And you can see this little slide of a rat brain, and these, where the lit up parts are where the concentrations of the CB1 receptors can be found. It's interesting to note that little says BR stem, that's the brain stem. It's a pretty dark area. The brain stem is where we find all of the vital functions being regulated. Things like breathing, swallowing, heart rate, blood pressure. So if you have a substance that has a lot of receptors that will respond in that area, and if you have an overdose, it's more likely to get poisoned in that area and for those vital functions to break down and for a person to die. There's a lot of opioid receptors in that area, which is why it can be lethal if a person has an overdose. This is not the case with cannabis. As you can see, nobody's ever died from a cannabis overdose. That's why mass consumption of marijuana is not lethal. And this slide shows that a little bit. Basically what this bar graph is showing is a ratio of the effective dose to the lethal dose. You can see way up on the top, cannabis, 1 over 20,000. So if an effective dose was, say, a little piece of cannabis that you're smoking, you would have to consume 20,000 of that to effectively be approaching lethality, and that's not really even possible. But compare that to something like aspirin, which is about 1 over 200. It's certainly possible to consume 200 aspirin. Go a little bit further down, you have tobacco at close to 1 over 20, methadone and codeine in the same range. Then you go down 1 out of 10, alcohol. Alcohol is much more dangerous than cannabis. I mean, it's not even comparable. Down at the bottom, you have heroin, 1 out of 6. So when people come and confront me about some sort of a fear that they've heard, some sort of the danger that cannabis can potentially cause, my first question that I ask them is, compared to what? Compared to common substances and drugs that were prescribed by your physician? I mean, certainly not. Compared to just normal behaviors, you know, it doesn't really even compare. If you take out and isolate a particular substance, any substance can be demonized. So always ask compared to what when people are talking about cannabis, and I think it puts it really into perspective pretty clearly. So we were talking about cannabis receptors, or cannabinoid receptors. Why do we have cannabinoid receptors? Well, the answer is that we make substances that are activated, that activate those receptors. And these were discovered in 1992. The most well-studied are the anandamide and the 2-AG, or 2-arachidiol glycerol. They're actually produced right out of the cell membrane, right out of fatty acids, the first known lipid-based transmitters. And the reason I talk about the dates is this is really recent science. Most of this isn't even taught in medical school. So you're learning you're getting some information that maybe you can even teach your medical friends. Now, the primary function of the endocannabinoid system is the maintenance of homeostasis. Anybody remember that word from science class way back? Homeostasis. It's balance. Endocannabinoids, like 2-AG, anandamide, they're synthesized as an adaptive response to cellular stress. And the aim is to maintain balanced cell function. A good example of this is in the synapses. In other words, the junction between each nerves. We have so many nerves in our brain alone, and they go out throughout our body. Between every nerve that communicates with another nerve is a synapse, a space. And where the endocannabinoid system fits into this is it's a negative feedback loop. On the top, you have a presynaptic nerve trying to send a message using these little red dots. They're the neurotransmitters, and they're received by the postsynaptic nerves to send a message. Well, what the endocannabinoid system does is it releases something like 2-AG right out of the cell membrane on the postsynaptic nerve to send a message to the presynaptic nerve, okay, I got the message. I mean, this makes a lot of sense. This keeps the nervous system calm and operating at maximum efficiency. What's interesting is that the stress response tends to downregulate that. In other words, those CB1 receptors are less effective when we have stress hormones circulating in our body, when we're under a stressful situation. This makes sense from the standpoint of survival. We don't want a relaxed nervous system if we're under serious actual threat. We want to be able to get away or fight or deal with the situation. But what happens when we're under chronic stress? What happens when every day we have to get in the car and face the awful traffic? Or what happens when you're waiting for the computer web page to finally load? We get stressed, and this chronic stress interferes with the endocannabinoid system's homeostatic functions. And this can lead to chronic degenerative changes and diseases. All right. So what happens when we supplement our endocannabinoid system with cannabis? Well, of course, it depends on the cannabinoid concentration. There are so many different hybrid versions of cannabis. This was talked about earlier in the previous panel. So many different ratios of the different cannabinoids. But basically, what cannabis does is it supplements the homeostatic contributions of our endocannabinoid system. And this is usually advantageous to well-being. This is why it treats so many different conditions. It's so helpful to so many different people in so many different situations. Generally, it relaxes the nervous and immune responses so they're more capable of dealing with problems when they arise. It reduces the stress response, the perception of pain, spasm, and a host of other cellular stress-related symptoms. Now, it's worth noting that heavy and chronic use of cannabis can also lead to tolerance. And this means that it requires an increased amount of cannabis intake for the same effect. But tolerance shouldn't be mistaken for addiction. Cannabis is not an addicting substance. It can be habit-forming, but then again, so are fiddling with our cell phones all the time. Again, compared to what? That's the question that I always like to ask people. 1 to 2 days of abstinence a week can greatly curb any kind of tolerance that people can experience from the use of cannabis. And just in summation, I would like to say that with cannabis as a medicine, less is often more. Just a little bit can help people deal with the pain or whatever kind of situation they are in, and basically lead functional, happy lives. Now, I know I'm running short on time, and I want to give you folks time, but I wanted to add one other thing, because medicine isn't my only interest in cannabis, and no, Perry, it isn't how it inspires my musical career. Is that I'm building a house out of hempcrete. This is out on the eastern side of Carolina, And I just wanted to show you a couple pictures. This is just, it's a standard frame house. But then what you do is you mix up hemp herbs, right? This little, on the foreground you see bits of the crushed up stalk. That's industrial hemp. This unfortunately was shipped from Chicago, which originally was grown in Great Britain. So it would have cost a lot less expensive if I could have bought it in Carolina. But so you mix this up in a mortar mixer with the lime and water. And then what you do is you pour it into forms that are spaced off of the studs on that house and tamp it in. There's my little wood tamper that we made. And after 3 days, that stuff cures. And so you can see here, we're gradually moving the forms up. And that's where we are right now. After it was all built, we plastered it with a 1/2 inch of plaster on the inside, on the outside. We have a very, very highly insulated house. Walls are a foot thick. And we're not moved in yet, but hopefully by the end of the year we might actually get there. Anyway, I want to thank you very much for your attention. Researchers and clinicians are beginning to understand how cannabis works as a medicine.
It's safer than cocaine and heroin too. Safer than methamphetamine. It's safer than aspirin, acetaminophen, hydrocodone, oxycodone, methadone, morphine. It's safer than vaccines, fluoride and caffeine, high fructose corn syrup, aspartame. It's safer than alcohol, beer and tobacco, and puking sugar from Hawaii.